Today we are going to learn about internal capsule. In this, you are supposed to know what is internal capsule, what are the parts of the internal capsule, its boundaries or relations, then the fiber constituents, then the blood supply, and the applied aspects. Internal capsule is a bundle of projection fibers, that is the axons, otherwise called white matter. They project from the cerebral cortex into the brainstem and spinal cord. That is why it is called projection fibers. The fibers which are starting from the cerebral cortex, that is the axons of the neurons which are there in the cerebrum, will run through the internal capsule into the brainstem and the spinal cord. The boundaries of the internal capsule is superiorly, inferiorly, medially, and laterally. Superiorly, you can see the fibers, how it is fanning out. You can see it is all the fibers which are converging to us. This fanning out structure is called corona radiata. That is the fibers which are entering into or going into, or either coming from the cerebral cortex or going upwards towards cerebral cortex. All these fibers just fan out like this, and this fanning out structure is called corona radiata. And inferiorly, here in this is the midbrain part, and they converge like a funnel, and that is called the cerebral peduncles. So superiorly corona radiata and inferiorly cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. Medially, here if you see, this is the medial aspect. Anteriorly, medially, this is the caudate nucleus, head of the caudate nucleus, and here you can see the thalamus, and on the lateral aspect you can see the lentiform nucleus, and the lentiform nucleus will contain the putamen here and the globus pallidus here. And you can see here the head of the caudate nucleus and the putamen are connected through the internal capsule like this. These are the fibers which are connecting the caudate nucleus and head of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So this, because of this striated pattern, the name given to the basal ganglia is corpus striatum. They have a striated appearance, and that is because of these fibers which are connected to the caudate nucleus and the putamen. So medially here the caudate nucleus head and the thalamus, and laterally we have the lentiform nucleus. Coming to the parts of the internal capsule, it has got an anterior limb. This is the anterior limb, and then we have a bend here, and this is called the genu, and from here till here almost, this is the posterior limb. So the and then we have a part which is lying behind this lentiform. This green color is the lentiform nucleus. Behind that, this part is called the retrolentiform part, and there is a part with dotted line here which is shown, a part which is there lying below the lentiform nucleus, that is called sublentiform part. So I repeat, we have an anterior limb, a genu, a posterior limb, a retrolentiform part, and a sublentiform part. So anterior limb will lie, the anterior limb will lie between the lentiform nucleus here and the head of the caudate nucleus. The posterior limb will lie between the lentiform nucleus and the thalamus, and genu is the portion between the anterior limb and the posterior limb. A retrolentiform part behind the lentiform nucleus, and sublentiform part below the lentiform nucleus. Coming to the fiber constituents, the main fibers which are shown here, you can see the dotted line here. This is the fibers which are here. They are the fibers which are running from the thalamus to the cortical areas, thalamocortical fibers, and the fibers which are here, that is the line fibers which are going from the cortex to the pons, and they are called corticopontine fibers. And then you can see fibers which are marked like this. These are fibers which are called corticonuclear or corticospinal fibers. So if you see the anterior limb, genu, and the posterior limb, we have thalamocortical fibers, or the thalamic radiation we call, the fibers which are going from the thalamus into the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, which we have got names: anterior thalamic radiation, the superior thalamic radiation, posterior thalamic radiation, and the inferior thalamic radiation. These are those. So mainly here we have thalamocortical fibers which are in the anterior limb. Genu and the posterior limb are the anterior and the superior thalamic radiation. And here you can see entire length anterior limb, and the genu and the posterior limb we have the corticopontine fibers. And here in the genu we have the corticonuclear fibers, and in the posterior limb we have the corticospinal fibers and the extrapyramidal fibers. I'll explain that later. This is the description of fibers. In the anterior limb we have descending fibers and ascending fibers. Descending fibers we have the frontopontine fibers and the frontothalamic fibers. Ascending fibers are the thalamo-frontal fibers, that is the anterior thalamic radiation. The anterior thalamic radiation are fibers starting from the ventral, anterior, and also medial nucleus of the thalamus, going into the cingulate gyrus, which are actually part of the Papez circuit. In the genu we have frontopontine fibers and corticonuclear fibers, that is the fibers which are starting from the cerebral cortex going to the cranial nerve nuclei, which are located in the brainstem. And ascending fibers which have the sensory fibers, superior thalamic radiation. Here is the superior thalamic radiation, which are starting from the ventral posteromedial and ventral posterolateral fibers, reaching the 312, that is the primary sensory area in the postcentral gyrus. And in the posterior limb we have frontopontine fibers, the corticospinal fibers, corticorubral fibers, corticoreticular fibers, and the paretothalamic fibers. So these are the fibers, main constituent of fibers. Largest part of the internal capsule is the posterior limb, and these are the fibers again, descending fibers, frontopontine fibers. See again, in the anterior limb, genu, and the posterior limb we have frontopontine fibers. Here in the posterior limb we have special the corticospinal fibers concerned with the upper limb, thorax, and the lower limb fibers are in the posterior limb. Then we have extrapyramidal, that is the corticorubral fibers, then the corticoreticular fibers, and the paretothalamic fibers. And the sensory part, ascending fibers, which are coming from again the ventral posteromedial and ventral posterolateral, that is the superior thalamic radiation, going to the primary sensory area 312. In the retrolentiform renticular or retrolentiform area, we have the occipitopontine fibers, that is going from the occipital lobe to the pons, pontine nuclei, and then we have corticorubral fibers and the occipitothalamic fibers. And ascending fibers are the optic radiation, which is otherwise called the posterior thalamic radiation, which is starting from the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus and then going to the primary visual cortex. And in the sublentiform area we have temporopontine fibers descending and the temporothalamic fibers, and We have ascending fibers, mainly the inferior thalamic radiation, otherwise called auditory radiation, starting from the medial geniculate body and then going to the primary auditory area 41 in the upper part of the temporal, superior temporal gyrus. So these are in short. To repeat, the anterior limb descending fibers, frontopontine mainly, the ascending fibers anterior thalamic radiation. In the genu we have frontopontine fibers descending, the superior thalamic radiation ascending. In the posterior limb we have the frontopontine, the corticospinal, the corticorubral and the corticoreticular fibers, and the ascending fibers are the superior thalamic radiation. Retrolentiform part, descending fibers are the occipitopontine fibers mainly, and the ascending fiber is the posterior thalamic radiation, otherwise optic radiation. In the sublentiform part, we have descending fibers, temporopontine fibers, ascending is the auditory radiation. The superior thalamic radiation, the thalamic radiations are three. Already I have told you about this. This you can see, which is going from the thalamus to the anterior frontal lobe, the superior going to the parietal lobe, posterior going to the occipital lobe, inferior going to the temporal lobe. I have already told the description about that. This is this part we can see here. This is the genu where we have got the corticonuclear fibers, mainly going to the head and neck region, that is the cranial nerve nuclei. Then we have the corticospinal fibers. The arrangement is like this. So you can see the upper limb, the trunk and the lower limb in the anterior posterior direction, and near the trunk area we have the corticorubral fibers, the extrapyramidal fibers. So mainly the anterior genu and posterior limb we have descending pyramidal fibers which are mainly corticonuclear and corticospinal. So arrangement from anterior to posterior. In the genu we have head and neck region fibers, then in the posterior limb we have upper limb, thorax and the lower limb fibers, and near the thorax we have the corticorubral fibers or the extrapyramidal fibers. Coming to the blood supply of the internal capsule, you can see here this is the circle of Willis-Yahr. This is the posterior cerebral artery, internal carotid artery, anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and this is the posterior communicating artery. See, this is the anterior limb. We can see the artery is coming from where. This is the anterior cerebral artery, will supply the anterior limb and the genu. See, and the middle cerebral artery is here. It is, you can see, follow the direction. This is one branch, which is going to supply the anterior limb, genu and mainly the posterior limb. So most of the posterior limb is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. And now you can see one more artery. See, some arteries are directly originating from the internal capsule, which are supplying the genu. And this artery is called anterior choroid artery, branch of the internal carotid artery, which are going to supply the posterior limb, part of the posterior limb and the retrolentiform area. And you can see the posterior cerebral artery, which is going to supply the retrolentiform and the sublentiform part. To repeat again, the anterior cerebral artery will supply the anterior limb and the genu. Middle cerebral artery will supply the anterior limb, genu and most of the posterior limb. The anterior choroid artery will supply the posterior limb and the retrolentiform part, and the posterior cerebral artery will supply retrolentiform and the sublentiform part. These are the descriptions. We have the lateral striate branch from the middle cerebral artery, which is going to supply anterior limb, genu and the posterior limb. The medial striate branches from the anterior cerebral artery will supply the anterior limb and the genu. The anterior choroid branch from the internal carotid artery will supply the posterior limb and the retrolentiform part, and the posterior cerebral will supply the retrolentiform and the sublentiform part. This is how the middle cerebral artery, which is there inside the lateral sulcus, which is going to supply the lentiform branches. You can see the lateral striate and the medial striate branches which are going there. This is the medial striate, this is the lateral striate branches which are supplying the internal capsule. Anterior limb is supplied, I told you already, by the anterior cerebral artery. One branch of the anterior cerebral artery is very long and very tortuous, which is going to supply the anterior limb. They are called the recurrent artery of Hubner. And recurrent artery is very long and slender, and it is more prone for the thrombosis. And the genu is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery through medial striate branches, and the middle cerebral artery through lateral striate branches and lenticulostriate branches, and directly from the branches coming from the internal cauda artery. Posterior limb, one of the branch of the middle cerebral artery is very important clinically. It is called the Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage, which is very prone for rupture and hemorrhage inside the internal capsule. And one branch of the anterior choroid artery, this anterior choroid artery itself is very tortuous, and the branch which is supplying the internal capsule is very prone for thrombosis, and that is why it is called the artery of cerebral thrombosis. Coming to the applied anatomy, the internal capsule is very, very important clinically because that is the commonest site where stroke occurs, and the fibers which are running through the internal capsule are very compact, and a small area, when it loses blood supply, can affect the body in a widespread manner. That means a small dot of hemorrhage or thrombosis can cause widespread paralysis of the body, especially right-sided hemiplegia or monoplegia of upper limb or lower limb, anything. But commonest thing which happens is the hemiplegia. That means one half of the body will be paralyzed. And the stroke is the condition where there is death of necrosis of the brain, especially due to lack of blood supply. And the major three causes of lack of blood supply to the brain are either thrombosis, that is clotting of blood inside the vascular system, or it can be due to embolism, or it can be due to hemorrhage. And the microaneurysm to the lenticular striate branches are the commonest one, which is going to rupture, leading to hemiplegia on the opposite side, contralateral hemiplegia. And along with that, there can be lower half of the face affected because of the facial artery, that is the upper motor neuron type of facial palsy. If there is usually because of the facial nerve getting affected because of the upper motor neuron. Already you might be knowing that the upper part of the face is supplied by both facial nerves from both the cerebral cortex. So whenever there is a lesion on one side of the internal capsule, there will be only one side, lower half of the face will be affected, and that is the commonest mode of presentation in case of either stroke caused by thrombosis, hemorrhage, or embolism. Thrombosis of the recurrent branch of the anterior cerebral artery will lead to affection of the upper limb, that is contralateral side, probably because of the anterior part of the genu will be affected with the paralysis of the lower half of the face. And the anterior choroid artery branches may be the affection of the anterior choroid artery may be usually symptomless because of the collateral blood supply received from the other arteries. So that is about the internal capsule. As I told you in the beginning, you are supposed to know what is internal capsule, what is the boundaries of the internal capsule or relations, You're supposed to know the fiber constituents. Then you're supposed to know the blood supply of it, and then the applied aspects. Please write down the questions which are supposed to be answered by you. What are the parts of internal capsule? Name the descending fibers which are present in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Name the areas supplied by the middle cerebral artery to the internal capsule. Which artery is called the artery of cerebral thrombosis? So please answer this question and send it to the class teachers after seeing the or studying the above class. Thank you.